After an exhausting day, I fell into bed, longing for oblivion, but in the middle of the night I felt a warm hand on my shoulder. My cousin Kyle, whom I hadn't seen in years, stood in the darkness, his eyes glittering with worry and something deeper. "I can't lie to myself anymore," he whispered, and in that moment my heart pounded with fear and desire. What would happen if we crossed that line? The world outside the door was asleep, but in my room, a storm was brewing. The rain streaked down the windows of my Seattle condo, a relentless drumbeat matching the exhaustion pulsing through my veins. It had been one of those days, 10 hours hunched over a screen, tweaking designs for a client who couldn't decide what they wanted, my neck stiff and my eyes burning. By the time I dragged myself through the door at 11 p.m., all I craved was the sweet oblivion of sleep. I didn't even bother with food, just kicked off my boots, peeled off my damp jacket, and collapsed onto the bed, the cool sheets swallowing me whole. The city hummed faintly outside, a distant lullaby as I sank into darkness. Sleep hit fast, a heavy, dreamless void. I don't know how long I was out, hours maybe, when something yanked me back. A shift in the air, subtle but sharp, like a thread snapping in the silence. My body registered it before my mind could catch up, a faint warmth, a whisper of movement. I groaned, half convinced it was a dream, my brain too sluggish to care. But then I felt it, a hand, light as a feather, brushing my shoulder. My eyes snapped open, heart slamming against my ribs as I squinted into the dim glow seeping from the hallway. There he was, Kyle, my cousin, perched on the edge of my bed like a ghost. His dark hair was messy, his hoodie rumpled, and his eyes. God, his eyes were locked on me, wide and wild, glinting with something I couldn't name. He'd shown up 2 days ago, crashing at my place after some blowout with his folks back in Oregon. We barely talked, too busy, too tired, but now, in the dead of night, he was here, invading my space. "Kyle?" My voice cracked, thick with sleep and confusion. "What the hell are you doing?" He didn't flinch, didn't pull back. His hand stayed on my shoulder, warm and steady, sending a jolt through me that I didn't expect. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice low, rough around the edges. I needed to see you." I propped myself up on my elbows, the sheets rustling as I tried to shake the fog from my head. "See me? It's—" I glanced at the clock glowing red on the nightstand, 2:47 a.m. "Almost 3 in the morning. What's going on?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and for a second I thought he'd bolt. But he didn't. He leaned closer, just enough that I could smell the faint cedar of his cologne, and my stomach twisted. "I can't keep lying to myself, Tyler," he whispered, his breath brushing my face. "Not about this. Not about you." My heart stopped, then kicked into overdrive. What the hell was he talking about? This was Kyle, my cousin, the guy I'd grown up with, the one who'd spent summers chasing me through the woods back home. But the way he was looking at me now, the raw edge in his voice, it wasn't family staring back at me. It was something else, something dangerous, something that made my skin prickle and my chest tighten. "Kyle, you're freaking me out," I said, but my voice wavered, betraying the heat creeping up my neck. I should have pulled away, should have told him to get out, but I didn't. I couldn't. His hand slid down my arm, fingers curling gently around my wrist, and I froze, caught in the electric pull of his touch. "I know," he said, softer now, almost pleading. "But I've been running from this for years. And tonight, I can't anymore." The room spun, the air thick with words he hadn't said yet, words I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Outside, the rain pounded harder, a chaotic rhythm drowning out the city, but in here, it was just us, teetering on the edge of something I couldn't unsee. My mouth went dry, my pulse a wild drumbeat in my ears. "What are you saying?" I managed, barely a whisper. He didn't answer, not with words. His eyes searched mine, desperate, vulnerable, and then he leaned in closer, his forehead inches from mine. "You feel it too," he said, more a statement than a question. "Don't you?" And damn it, I did. I didn't want to, didn't know how to name it, but it was there, a spark, a pull, a forbidden ache I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten it existed. Until now. Until him. The silence after Kyle's words was deafening, thicker than the rain hammering the windows. My condo felt like a pressure cooker, the air buzzing with something I couldn't dodge. His hand still gripped my wrist, warm and unyielding, pinning me to this moment I wasn't ready for. "Feel it too?" he'd said, and my chest burned with the truth I didn't want to face. I yanked my arm back, scrambling to sit up, the sheets tangling around my legs like a trap. "Kyle, stop!" I snapped, my voice sharper than I meant. This isn't right. You're my cousin, for God's sake!" The words tasted like ash, bitter and hollow, because even as I said them, my pulse raced for all the wrong reasons. His eyes didn't waver, dark, stormy, boring into me like he could see every lie I'd ever told myself. "I know what I am to you," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But that doesn't change what I felt. Not since we were kids, not since I figured out why I couldn't stop thinking about you." He leaned closer, his breath hitching. "I've been running from it, Ty. From you. From me. Years of pretending I didn't ache every time you smiled at someone else." My stomach dropped, a free fall I couldn't stop. Kids? Years? This wasn't some late-night impulse. It was a confession carved deep, and it hit me like a punch. "You're insane," I muttered, but my voice cracked, and I hated how weak it sounded. I swung my legs off the bed, needing distance, needing air, but Kyle grabbed my arm again, pulling me back. "Don't run from this," he pleaded, his grip tight but his eyes softer, raw. "Tell me you don't feel it. Tell me I'm wrong, and I'll leave. Right now." I opened my mouth to say it, to shove him out the door and bury this insanity, but nothing came. My heart thundered, my skin buzzed where he touched me, and suddenly I was moving, not away but toward him. My lips crashed into his, hard and reckless, a collision of fear and want I couldn't hold back. He gasped against me, then kissed me back, fierce, hungry, like he'd been starving for this. His hands slid to my neck, pulling me closer, and for a heartbeat, the world dissolved into heat and chaos. Then, bang, bang, bang. The door rattled, a sledgehammer of sound that ripped us apart. I jolted back, panting, my lips still tingling as Kyle's eyes widened in panic. "Tyler! Open up!" a voice bellowed, Mrs. Carter, the nosy widow next door. "It's 3 a.m. What's with the damn noise?" "Shit!" I hissed, adrenaline spiking. Kyle bolted upright, his face flushed, and before I could stop him, he dove for the closet, yanking the door shut behind him. I stumbled to my feet, heart hammering, and cracked the front door open. Mrs. Carter stood there in a ratty bathrobe, her glare slicing through me. "Keep it down, or I'm calling the super!" she barked, peering past me suspiciously. I mumbled an apology, slamming the door as she huffed off. The room spun as I leaned against it, my breath ragged. Kyle crept out, his hoodie askew, guilt and longing etched across his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, stepping closer. "I didn't mean to." "Don't." I cut him off, my voice shaking. "Just don't." But he didn't back away, and neither did I. His fingers brushed mine, tentative, electric, and I cursed myself for not pushing him away. "What are we doing, Kyle?" I rasped, my resolve crumbling. He swallowed, his gaze fierce. "Something real. Something we can't take back." The rain roared outside, but inside, it was a different storm, one I wasn't sure I'd survive. Mrs. Carter's interruption had saved me from crossing a line, but Kyle's words, his touch, his damn certainty, they'd already dragged me over it. And the worst part? I didn't want to climb back. The morning after Kyle's confession broke over Seattle like a bruise, gray, heavy, and unforgiving. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, tapping against the windows of my condo with a rhythm that matched the dull ache in my skull. I'd barely slept, my mind a tangle of his words, his lips, the way his hands had felt against my skin. Every time I closed my eyes I saw him, those wild, desperate eyes staring into me, peeling back years of denial I didn't even know I'd built. By the time the clock hit 7 a.m., I was already up, pacing the hardwood floor in my socks, the coffee pot hissing on the counter. I needed to get out, away from him, away from the chaos he'd unleashed in my room. Kyle was still asleep on the pull-out couch in the living room, or at least I assumed he was. I hadn't checked. Couldn't. The thought of facing him after last night made my stomach lurch, a mix of dread and something hotter, something I refused to name. I grabbed my jacket, scribbled a note. "Gone for coffee, back later," and slipped out the door before he could wake up and trap me with those eyes again. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into purgatory, the hum of it mocking my cowardice. Pike Place Market was just waking up when I got there, the air sharp with the tang of fish and the earthy bite of roasted beans. I beelined for the little cafe tucked near the flower stalls, the one with the mismatched chairs and baristas who didn't care enough to ask questions. My hand shook as I ordered a double espresso, the barista's bored, coming up, barely registering. I sank into a corner table, staring out at the drizzle-slicked cobblestones, trying to piece myself back together. What the hell had I done? Kissing him, my cousin, my blood, wasn't just reckless. It was a grenade lobbed into the fragile normalcy of my life. And yet, the memory of it burned, electric and alive, refusing to let me shove it down. I was halfway through the espresso, the bitter heat scalding my throat, when the chair across from me scraped back. My head snapped up, and there he was, Kyle, his hoodie damp from the rain, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on me like I was the only thing in the room. "You didn't think you could run from me that easy, did you?" he said, his voice low, edged with something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't far off. "Jesus, Kyle," I hissed, glancing around to see if anyone noticed. The cafe was sparse. 2 tourists snapping photos of their lattes, an old guy reading a paper, but it still felt like every ear was tuned to us. "What are you doing here? How'd you even—" "Your note," he cut in, dropping into the seat without asking. "Figured you'd come here. You always do when you're freaking out." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and I caught the faint cedar of his cologne again, the same scent that had flooded my senses last night. My chest tightened. "I'm not freaking out," I lied, my fingers curling around the espresso cup too hard. "I just needed air. Space. You should have stayed back." "Bullshit," he said, sharp enough that the old guy glanced over, then back to his paper. Kyle lowered his voice, but his gaze didn't waver. "You're avoiding me. After last night, after what happened, you can't just pretend it didn't." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words stuck. He wasn't wrong. I'd bolted because I couldn't face him, couldn't face myself. "It was a mistake," I said finally, forcing the words out like they'd choke me otherwise. "We were tired, wired, whatever. It didn't mean anything." His eyes darkened, a storm rolling in. "Don't do that," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Don't lie to me." "To yourself?" "You kissed me back, Ty. You felt it, I know you did." Heat surged up my neck, and I slammed the cup down harder than I meant, the clatter drawing a glance from the barista. "Felt what, Kyle? Huh? You're my cousin. This isn't some rom-com, it's fucked up." My voice cracked, louder than I wanted, and I winced, dropping it to a hiss. "You're ruining everything, our family, our history, me. Why'd you have to say it? Why now?" He didn't flinch, didn't back down. Instead, he leaned closer, his hands flat on the table like he was bracing for a fight. "Because I'm done hiding," he said, each word deliberate, heavy. "You think this is easy for me? I grew up in that shithole town, Grants Pass, where every kid called me fag before I even knew what it meant. Where my dad broke a bottle on the table when I tried to tell him I might not be normal." His voice shook, just for a second, and he swallowed hard. "I've spent years choking it down, pretending I didn't look at you too long, didn't want you too much. But I can't anymore. Not after last night." The air punched out of me, his words a blade twisting in my gut. Grants Pass, our summers there, the dusty streets, the endless teasing from kids who'd turn on you for breathing wrong, it flooded back. I'd seen the bruises on him once, blamed it on roughhousing, but now... "Kyle," I started softer, my anger fraying at the edges. "I didn't know. I didn't. You didn't have to." He cut in, his hands sliding across the table, stopping an inch from mine. "I didn't want you to. But now you do. And I'm asking you, Ty, don't run from this. Don't tell me you don't feel it too." My throat closed, his confession stripping me bare. I stared at his hand, so close, the faint scars on his knuckles from years I hadn't been part of. And then, without thinking, my fingers brushed his, tentative, trembling, but there. A jolt shot through me, undeniable, and his breath hitched, his eyes flaring with hope and fear and everything I tried to bury. "I don't know what I feel," I whispered, barely audible over the cafe's hum. "But yeah, I feel something." My hand stayed, locked with his under the table, hidden from the world but screaming loud in my chest. "What the hell do we do now?" He didn't answer right away, just squeezed my hand, his grip fierce and steady. "We figure it out," he said, voice raw but certain. "Together." The drizzle outside streaked the windows, blurring the market into a watercolor mess, but in here, it was clear, too clear. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and Kyle wasn't letting me go back. My heart pounded, torn between terror and a fragile, reckless hope. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The days after that morning in the cafe blurred into a secret I couldn't shake. Seattle's gray sprawl became our playground, a maze of stolen moments and whispered promises that felt like a fever dream. Kyle and I didn't talk about it, not really. We didn't name what we were doing, didn't slap a label on the way his hand found mine in the dark or how my pulse spiked every time he grinned at me over a takeout box. It was easier that way, letting the unspoken hum between us fill the gaps. But the weight of it, of him, grew heavier with every touch, every glance, until it pressed against my ribs like a second heartbeat. We hid it well, or so I told myself. At my office downtown, I buried myself in mock-ups and meetings, nodding through client calls while my mind replayed the brush of his lips from the night before. Kyle spent his days wandering the city. He'd quit his dead-end job in Oregon before showing up at my door, claiming he needed a reset. I'd catch him sketching on the balcony when I got home, his pencil scratching out jagged lines that somehow turned into art. "What's that one?" I'd ask, and he'd shrug, smirking. "You, maybe." It was a game we played, teasing, circling, never quite landing on the truth. But at night, the pretense fell away. We'd sneak out after dark, weaving through Capitol Hill's neon-lit streets, ducking into alleys for a kiss that tasted like rain and rebellion. One evening, we climbed the fire escape to my building's roof, the city sprawling below us like a glittering trap. The air was cool, sharp with the promise of fall, and Kyle pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping until some old song, Tom Petty, maybe, crackled through the tiny speaker. "Dance with me," he said, half laughing, and before I could protest, he grabbed my waist, tugging me into a clumsy sway. "Idiot," I muttered, but I didn't pull away. His hands were warm through my shirt, his breath close enough to stir the hair at my temple. The skyline blinked at us, Space Needle piercing the haze, ferries cutting through the black water of Puget Sound, and for a minute, it was just us, untouchable. I rested my forehead against his, the music a faint thread tying us to the moment, and whispered, "This feels too good to be real." "It is real," he murmured back, his fingers tightening. "That's why it scares you." He was right. It did scare me, terrified me, down to my bones. Every second with him was a risk, a step closer to a ledge I couldn't see the bottom of. What if someone saw us? What if my sister, his parents, the whole damn family found out? The thought clawed at me, but then he'd kiss me again, slow and deep, and the fear drowned in the heat of him. That bubble burst one night, mid-dance on that same roof. His phone buzzed, slicing through the song, and he froze, pulling it out with a frown. "It's Mom," he said, his voice flat, and my stomach dropped. He answered, stepping away, and I caught fragments, her sharp tone, his clipped replies. "Yeah, I'm fine. No, I don't know when. I'll figure it out." He hung up, staring at the screen like it might bite, then turned to me, his jaw tight. "She wants me back home," he said. "Dad's sick, nothing major, just enough to guilt me into showing up. She doesn't know about this." He gestured vaguely between us, and the air thickened. "I've gotta go, Ty. Tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" The word hit like a slap. "You just got here. What about?" I stopped, not sure what I meant. What about us? What about this thing we'd barely started? He crossed the roof, closing the gap, and grabbed my hands, his grip almost bruising. "I don't want to," he said, his voice rough. "But if I don't, she'll come looking. And if she finds out." He didn't finish, didn't need to. The specter of our family loomed, a guillotine waiting to drop. I nodded, numb, and he pulled me into a kiss, fierce, desperate, like he was pouring everything he couldn't say into it. The next morning, he was gone. I found a note slipped under my coffee mug. "I'll come back. But you've got to fight for this, for us. I can't do it alone." His handwriting was messy, urgent, and it gutted me. I stood there, the condo silent except for the drip of the faucet, and felt the emptiness settle in. The roof, the streets, the nights, they echoed with him, and without him, I was unmoored. Days stretched into a week, then two. I threw myself into work, sketching designs I didn't care about, but every line reminded me of his pencil scratches. I'd stand on the balcony, staring at the city, and wonder if he was staring back from Oregon. The note sat on my counter, a taunt, a lifeline. "Fight for us," he'd said. But how? Tell the world I'd fallen for my cousin? Burn every bridge I'd ever built? The thought made me sick, but the alternative, losing him, made me sicker. One night, I climbed to the roof alone. The stars were out, faint through the city glow, and I pressed my palms to the cold concrete, breathing hard. His voice echoed in my head. Something real. And damn it, it was. Too real to let go. I didn't know how we'd make it work, didn't know if we could, but standing there, I decided. I'd fight. For him. For whatever this was. The phone stayed silent in my pocket, but my heart thundered with a choice I couldn't unmake. Kyle was a risk I'd take, even if it broke me. The decision to go after Kyle hit me like a freight train, raw and unstoppable. 2 weeks had crawled by since he'd left, each day a slow bleed of silence that gnawed at me until I couldn't take it anymore. His note still sat on my counter, ink smudged from my thumb running over it too many times. Fight for us. I'd stared at it every night, the words sinking deeper until they weren't just a plea, they were a dare. Seattle felt hollow without him, the condo too quiet, the roof too empty. By the time Friday rolled around, I'd made up my mind. I packed a bag, called in sick to work with a half-assed excuse, and hit the road south to Grants Pass. The drive was 4 hours, a straight shot down I-5 through mist-cloaked forests and truck-stop towns. My hands gripped the wheel tighter with every mile, my stomach a knot of nerves and reckless hope. What was I even going to say? "Hey, I'm here to blow up our family because I can't stop thinking about you?" It sounded insane, even in my head, but the alternative, letting him slip away, was worse. The radio buzzed with static, some country song about lost love, and I turned it off, letting the hum of the engine fill the void. Rain streaked the windshield as I crossed the Oregon border, a fitting omen for whatever mess I was about to walk into. Grants Pass hadn't changed. Same sleepy streets, same weathered houses, same judgmental air clinging to the pines. I pulled up to Kyle's parents' place just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. A family barbecue was in full swing out back, smoke curling from the grill, laughter drifting through the screen door. I spotted Kyle before he saw me, standing near the picnic table in a flannel shirt, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders tense. My chest ached at the sight of him, and I almost turned the car around. Almost. I killed the engine, stepped out, and walked straight into the lion's den. Heads turned as I crossed the yard, my aunt's sharp squint, my uncle's gruff. "Who's this?" But I didn't stop until I was in front of Kyle. His eyes widened, a flash of shock and something softer, and before he could speak, I grabbed his arm. "We need to talk," I said loud enough that the chatter died. He nodded dazed, and I pulled him toward the house, ignoring the stares boring into my back. Inside, the kitchen smelled of charred meat and lemon cleaner, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in me. I let go of him, pacing the linoleum, my heart hammering. I couldn't stay away. I started, my voice rough. "You told me to fight, so here I am. I don't know what the hell we're doing, but I know I stopped, the words catching, then forced them out. "I love you, Kyle. Not like family. Like this." His breath hitched, his face crumpling with relief and fear. "Ty," he whispered, stepping closer, but the screen door banged open before he could say more. My aunt stormed in, her apron stained with barbecue sauce, her glare cutting through us like a blade. "What's going on?" she snapped, her voice tight. "Tyler, why were you here dragging him off like that?" I froze, every rehearsed line evaporating. Kyle's hand brushed mine, a silent anchor, and I took a breath. "No more hiding. I'm here for him." I said, turning to face her. Because I love him. And I'm not pretending otherwise anymore. The room went dead silent, the air sucked out like a vacuum. Her mouth opened, then closed, her face paling. You what? She choked out, and then the yelling started. My uncle, cousins spilling in from the yard, a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. That's sick! My uncle roared, slamming a beer can on the counter. Your family, you twisted bastard! Someone, Kyle's sister, maybe, threw a plate, the crash punctuating the chaos. Kyle stepped in front of me, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. Stop it, he said, loud enough to cut through the noise. I love him too. If you can't handle that, that's on you, not us. He grabbed my hand, interlocking our fingers, and the room erupted again, but I barely heard it. His grip was all that mattered, solid and real. His mom pointed at the door, her face twisted with fury. Get out. Both of you. You're not welcome here. The words stung, but Kyle didn't flinch. He pulled me outside, past the gaping relatives, the overturned chairs, the smoldering grill. Rain hit us as we reached the driveway, cold and relentless, soaking through my jacket. We stopped by my car, breathing hard, and he turned to me, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes fierce. I'm sorry, he said, voice cracking. I didn't think it'd. Don't. I cut him off, pulling him into me. His arms wrapped around my back, tight and desperate, and I pressed my lips to his, rain mixing with the salt of our kiss. We're free, I murmured against him. They don't get to decide who we are. He nodded, a shaky laugh escaping. We'll build something new, he said, his hands framing my face. Just us. The rain pounded down, washing away the wreckage behind us. We stood there, soaked and defiant, two outcasts carving a future from the ruins. Love had won, for now. But as we climbed into the car, the road ahead loomed dark and uncertain. We'd fought, we'd chosen, but the cost was steep, and the world beyond Grant's Pass wouldn't be kind. Still, with Kyle beside me, his hand on my thigh, I believed we could make it. Victory tasted bittersweet, fragile as the rain, but it was ours.